Welcome to lecture number 53. This is topic 5.11, the failure of Reconstruction. The theme is American and National Identity. The learning objective is explain how and why Reconstruction resulted in continuity and change in regional and national understandings of what it means to be an American. There's a lot to unpack in this learning objective, so just remember that anything that has to do with how people understand what it means to be American is important. There's only two key concepts to this lecture, but each is broken up into two parts. The first part of the first key concept is Southern plantation owners continued to own the majority of the region's land even after Reconstruction. After Southern states earned readmission into the Union and Reconstruction was over, white Southerners slowly get back into the positions of influence that they had before the Civil War. These democratic states are said to be redeemed. Thus, Redeemer governments were those that were led by whites who had supported the Confederacy and opposed equality for newly freed blacks. They passed black codes, laws that attempt to control the black population. They prohibit African Americans from taking loans, purchasing land, testifying against whites in court. They even went so far as to make laws to make it illegal for them to be unemployed. If they were unemployed, they could be sent to jail and then be hired out in a form of involuntary servitude. The Redeemer government is caricatured on the screen as three Southerners stand over an African American with the flag on the ground. It was done by a famous cartoonist of the era, Thomas Nast. One of the men portrayed in the cartoon is Nathaniel Bedford, who created the KKK. Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, had been elected as a U.S. Senator for the state of Georgia shortly after the Civil War ended under Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. He had to give up the seat when the Congressional Reconstruction started. By the later years of Reconstruction, he is elected to the House of Representatives as part of this wave of Redeemer governments. Despite owning the majority of the land in the South, whites still needed labor, and they go looking to the people who had provided that labor prior to the Civil War. So the next part of the key concept delves deeper into the forms of labor white plantation owners turned to. Tenant farming and sharecropping. It says former slaves sought land ownership but generally fell short of self-sufficiency, as an exploitative and soil-intensive sharecropping system limited blacks and poor whites access to the land in the South. Tenant farming was the first of these new methods. Tenant farmers used their own tools, their own seed, and they would pay a rent for pieces of land from these large landholders. At the end of the harvest, they would sell their crops and try to make money, and then continue paying rent for the following year. But as the soil's quality continues to deteriorate and crop prices continue to drop, their profits declined over the years. Sometimes it ended in an accumulation of debt for tenant farmers that could result in the farmers repaying the plantation owners in the form of labor. Sharecropping was similar to tenant farming, except it resulted in even fewer freedoms for the sharecropper. The landowner provided the tools, the seed, and the land. Instead of taking cash as payment for their rents, sharecroppers paid with a portion of their crop at harvest. The landowner determined the amount, sometimes it was as much as 50% of the total crop. This ended in more accumulation of debt, and it lengthened the contracts to pay off their debts. As sharecroppers often ended a growing season in debts to the landowner, and the only way that they could pay the landowner back is to extend their contract on the land, it created a de facto version of slavery, where slavery had already supposedly ended. The images on the screen look more modern than the Reconstruction period, and that's because the sharecropping system went into the 20th century. The next key concept begins in the following way. Segregation, violence, Supreme Court decisions, and local political tactics progressively stripped away African American rights. One of the biggest failures of Reconstruction is that the gains on equality are slowly taken away. 1876 is usually the year that marks the end of Reconstruction as a result of the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. The election was close for several reasons. The Panic of 1873 had soured Americans on the continued efforts of Reconstruction in the South. Some Southern states had been readmitted into the Union, which meant that Democratic opposition to the Republican Party was also growing. However, the most important reason why the election was so close was because of election fraud and voter intimidation in the southern states of Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. In South Carolina alone, the number of votes cast represented 101% of the total number of eligible voters in the state, and over 150 black Republicans were murdered. A 15-member commission is appointed to determine the validity of the returns of the states in question. It was composed of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. Eventually, the commission gives the necessary votes to Rutherford B. Hayes over the Democrat Samuel Tilden, in what is called the Compromise of 1877. In exchange for the presidency, Republicans promised to remove the last troops from the South. The image at the top, by Thomas Nast, depicts the compromise between the North and the South that ends Reconstruction at the expense of equality and all those who died in the Civil War. The compromise allowed Redeemer governments to take hold and pass Jim Crow laws, which are laws that segregate blacks and whites. The name Jim Crow comes from an old minstrel show and minstrel song. These were variety shows in the South. It is a highly racialized portrayal of a black man in ragged clothing, usually portrayed as dumb, unintelligent, or foolish. There's also extra-legal methods used to take away the rights of black Americans. Violence used by the KKK, founded in 1867 by former Confederate soldiers, and the White League, another white supremacist group, threatened African Americans with lynchings for exercising their voting rights. However, there is a federal response to this. The FORS Acts are passed by Congress to at least protect the physical safety of African Americans. This iteration of the KKK is eliminated as a result, but it will spring up again in the early 20th century and then again in the late 20th century. There are two Supreme Court decisions that are important in how they stripped away African American rights. The Slaughterhouse cases in 1873 weakened the 13th and 14th Amendments. The Civil Rights cases in 1883 declare the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional. The civil rights cases are more important because they limit Congress's ability to enforce these constitutional amendments that try to guarantee the rights of citizens. There wasn't unanimous consent in the court in the civil rights cases. One Supreme Court Justice, John Marshall Harlan, wrote a dissent against the majority opinion that left African Americans vulnerable. He said, "Today it is the colored race which is denied, by corporations and individuals wielding public authority, rights fundamental in their freedom and citizenship. At some future time it may be some other race that will fall under the ban. If the constitutional amendments be enforced, according to the intent with which, as I conceive, they were adopted, there cannot be, in this republic, any class of human beings in practical subjection to another class, with power in the latter to dole out to the former just such privileges as they may choose to grant." Harlan was very clear that he interpreted the Reconstruction amendments as being very direct in their attempts to give equality to all people, that one group cannot choose how many or how few rights another group may get. Unfortunately, his colleagues on the Supreme Court did not agree with him. The local political tactics used by state and local governments includes vagrancy laws. These laws made it illegal to be unemployed. When men were charged with being unemployed, they were put in jail and then they were put in a convict work gang to pay off their fine. These convict work gangs would be hired out to plantation owners at extremely low wage rates. It created another form of coerced labor or legalized slavery. The 13th Amendment technically allowed it because involuntary servitude in the United States could be used as punishment for someone that has been duly convicted of a crime. Despite all those failures, shortly after Reconstruction ends, the 14th and 15th Amendments are going to be important for future periods. The last part of the key concept says the 14th and 15th Amendments eventually became the basis for court decisions upholding civil rights in the 20th century. The 14th Amendment will be necessary to apply the rest of the Bill of Rights to the states, beginning in 1925 in the court case Gitlow v. New York. In this court case, the Supreme Court says that given the wording of the 14th Amendment, no state shall create a law that's going to infringe on citizens' rights. It means that states cannot make any laws that infringe on the civil liberties granted by any other amendment in the Bill of Rights. Previously, the Bill of Rights only prevented Congress from making laws that could infringe on people's civil liberties, and the 14th Amendment changed that. In 1954, the Supreme Court declared school segregation unconstitutional in the case Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The court decided the case based on the 14th Amendment. Linda Brown, whose parents were suing to attend an all-white school, was said to have had her due process and equal protection rights infringed upon through segregation, so therefore all schools must desegregate. However, it took several years for school desegregation to become widespread. Later on, the 15th Amendment will be used to strike down all-white primaries, grandfather clauses, and gerrymandered districts. Both were tactics that tried to limit African American participation in elections, meanwhile protecting whites' access to the ballot. Alright, so here's the recap. White Southerners regained their political and economic influence after Reconstruction. Sharecropping and tenant farming tied blacks and poor whites to the land. Reconstruction's end is usually marked with Hayes's elections. The collection of actions to undo the gains of equality for African Americans are really what ends Reconstruction, and the 14th and 15th Amendment will be used in the 20th century to solidify gains on equality. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen, and if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit APUSHslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.